Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the public consultation of FSC Procedure 60006B Risk Assessment Framework.
Welcome to the forefront of change in sustainable forestry. We invite you to participate in the global consultation on FSC requirements, aligning with the EU regulation on deforestation-free products. This consultation features 3 sets of requirements, each crucial for the evolution of the FSC standard. Introducing the voluntary FSC regulatory module, designed to enhance forest management, chain of custody, and controlled wood practices. It also outlines accreditation requirements for certification bodies, aligning FSC standards with EUDR compliance. Presenting FSC advice notes, proposing system-wide changes. These changes not only align with EUDR, but strengthen our general certification requirements, making it deforestation-free and addressing supply chain mixing risks. Explore the expanded scope of FSC risk assessments. No longer limited to controlled wood, these assessments now apply to all certificate holders, demonstrating robust risk assessment and mitigation measures for stronger systems and EUDR compliance. How does this affect you? Even if you're not trading with the EU, understanding these system-wide shifts and risk assessments is essential. This consultation is open to all stakeholders, and your input is vital to maintaining FSC as a leader in sustainable forestry. Whether in English, Spanish, or French, we would love to hear your thoughts. Visit the FSC EUDR webpage for more information. Together against deforestation.
Hello, everybody. Should you have missed the whole video, it is just our introductory video to highlight the ongoing public consultations. The link is available in the chat. This webinar offers simultaneous translation. Should you be interested to hear this webinar in either French or Spanish, please use the Zoom control panel and select Interpretation, just like in the screen, and find the correct language you'd like to hear it in. As you might have noticed, we have disabled the chat function for this webinar. However, we are still keen to hear and address your questions. To place a question, use the Q&A feature with Zoom as indicated on the slide here. Please be sure to not include your name and instead be anonymous so that we can protect your personal data. In addition, like any question that you find interesting so we can be sure to address the questions with the most likes and with the most interest for those participating today. In this webinar, we will cover mainly the current consultation on our risk assessment framework. We will provide a short overview of the framework, why we are updating it, and the key changes. Some of you might have been present in the earlier webinars, and we will be presenting much of the same content with a bit more additional detail and a Q&A focus specifically on these risk assessments. The presentation part should take approximately no more than 45 minutes to allow for enough time for the question and answer part afterwards. I have colleagues on the call with me who have developed the requirements, so based on the provided questions, they will be answering appropriately. The presentation part is currently being recorded and will be made available on the process page. Please be sure to keep your questions related to the content of this presentation and ongoing consultation. We cannot answer individual scenarios and, as just mentioned, are prioritizing questions with the most votes and then as time allows. Now, let's talk about how and why we are updating our risk assessment framework. For those that might not be aware, we are already leaders in the fields of risk assessment development. Our existing controlled wood risk assessment framework is already a risk-based approach. In the past years, we have been working with stakeholders across the globe to develop 60 existing risk assessments, setting a strong foundation for risk assessment development and revisions. FSC risk assessments assess the risk of sourcing material from supply areas and establish mitigation measures to address those identified risks. Companies can use the mitigation measures from the assessment or propose their own mitigation measures that are considered more efficient and fit to their context. The risk assessment is a document that contains indicators covering several key requirements for FSCs such as high conservation values, human and labor rights, environmental protection, among others. How the risk assessments are developed is through the risk assessment framework, which ensures uniform and robust requirements for assessing those risks. So, why are risk assessments important for FSC? Risk assessments help to understand the potential risks that exist in a country, region, or part of a country regarding the different requirements that are key in our FSC certification system. The requirements contained in the risk assessment framework are undergoing a revision process as part of the procedure FSC Pro 60006PB. It is important to highlight that the code of this procedure has changed from FSC Pro 60002A, the Controlled Wood Risk Assessment Framework, to FSC Pro 60006B in order to align all FSC country requirements, for example, our forest stewardship standards and FSC risk assessments. The risk assessment framework is now an addendum procedure to FSC Pro 60006, which contains the process requirements for all FSC country requirements. We started this revision process of the risk assessment framework back in November of 2021, including in the scope of the revision several aspects to improve on content and process requirements that were identified by FSC and stakeholders during the development of the existing 60 controlled wood risk assessments, as well as the need to align with the strategy for FSC mixed products and controlled wood, the FSC Global Strategic Plan from 2021 to 2026, existing normative documents, and other parallel revision processes. In June of 2023, the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, the EUDR, was published, and we've tried to accommodate our revision process to ensure analysis and alignment of our risk assessment framework with EUDR requirements. In the coming slides, you'll be seeing a little bit more details about these changes that we are proposing to risk assessments. As presented, our risk assessments are under the risk assessment framework, an existing revision process from the Controlled Wood Risk Assessment Framework, now FSC Pro 60006B. It outlines risk assessment and mitigation practices that can be key tools for applying EUDR and FSC regulatory module requirements, as we have incorporated EUDR requirements into this revision so the risk assessments produced are EUDR aligned. And speaking of EUDR, what is EUDR? The EUDR stands for EU Regulation on Deforestation-Free Products. It is a landmark EU law to minimize the EU's contribution to deforestation and degradation. FSC has been engaging with EU lawmakers on this regulation, and we encourage you to review the recording from our January 18th presentation to learn more about this engagement. What requirements are included in the EUDR? Amongst them, the main requirements are that products are to be deforestation-free and produced in accordance with relevant legislation, which includes, for example, the protection and rights and principles of free, prior, and informed consent. This is already strongly aligned with FSC. While FSC does go beyond EUDR in terms of social and legal requirements, nonetheless, we have found that there are differences in the requirements of EUDR and existing FSC requirements. Predominantly, those differences include more information gathering, such as traceability and geolocation information, and more requirements for due diligence, as well as some terminology and related definitions are different. Due diligence in the EUDR is essentially the collecting of information, assessing risk, and mitigating this risk where needed. Information collection includes data such as geolocation on all plots of land, date or time range at the time of production or harvesting, suppliers and buyers, country of production, common and scientific names, and quantities. This information is then assessed for any related risks. EU will be classifying certain countries as low risk, and for those, only a simplified due diligence would be required. In all other countries, risk assessments are still required. Of course, where any non-negligible risk is found, it must then be mitigated. I'd now like to invite our System Performance Director, Joanna Nowakowska, to give a little bit more background into what FSC has been working on.
Thank you, Janika, and welcome everyone. I will start with stressing that since its inception, EUDR has been very important for FSC as it strongly aligns with our mission and vision to preserve forests. In fact, FSC had been developing our policy to address conversion in parallel with the EUDR, introducing stricter anti-deforestation and anti-degradation principles that are applicable for our whole system. And although FSC is already significantly aligned with EUDR, there are still some differences that we need to address. At the same time, we need to make sure that our system is still accessible for those who do not need to comply with the regulation. And in this respect, we have been facing rather opposite expectations. Those stakeholders associated with EU market were asking us to fully align with the EUDR and as soon as possible, while those who do not need to comply wanted to avoid the changes that are not relevant for them. Our way to enable FSC for both was to introduce a voluntarily add-on standard that is applicable based on and at the top of our usual requirements. We have called this standard regulatory module, and it is our key normative offering. The regulatory module introduces all applicable EUDR requirements, basically as a copy-paste from the regulation, and among those, the most prominent ones, such as geolocation or traceability. And in relation to those most prominent requirements introduced by EUDR, the technology component is very important, and FSC is working to also offer technology solution. The slide mentioned blockchain, but we are working on also other very useful tools, including, for example, risk assessment dashboards. Technology solutions are not part of this webinar, and we invite you to consult other sources in this respect. Now, with introduction of the regulatory module, we are addressing the needs of those who do need to comply with regulation. However, the strong links that exist between EUDR and FSC policy to address conversion, as well as complexity of supply chains, in which only some suppliers would choose to use the module while others not, required us to also introduce certain system-wide changes which apply to all certificate holders. These changes were needed to preserve system integrity and as a foundation and condition for the credibility of the voluntarily add-on standard. And one of the most prominent system-wide changes relate to risk assessments. And risk assessments is a document that simply describes the risk for a given area according to series of various indicators. In the past, FSC allowed its certificate holders to assess the risk on their own. However, we faced certain integrity and quality issues, leading to FSC taking over the development of risk assessments and requiring their use by our certificate holders. So far, we have required the use of our risk assessments only in the context of controlled wood, so you can associate it with our mass balance system or FSC mix products. However, with EUDR requiring risk assessments from all operators, we wanted to make sure that our risk assessments can also serve the regulation. But first and foremost, that there is only one uniform, credible, and consistent risk assessment across the whole FSC system, whether you are using regulatory module or not. And in this webinar, we are very pleased to dive you deeper in this risk assessment concept. With this, back to you, Janika.
Thank you, Joanna. So, through this extensive process on the revision of these requirements for risk assessments, it has resulted in a few key changes. We now have an expanded applicability, as now the produced risk assessments will be aligned with EUDR requirements and can be used for forest management and chain of custody users as well. Our existing risk assessments are currently in PDF format and quite long, and now they will be a data set in Excel so that they can be easily transferred to technology platforms to complement relevant tools such as GIS tools and showing geopolitical scales. The sources used in this revision now include more objective and standardized sources with an expansive source list, which have been assessed for relevance and reliability. To align with EUDR and have the same terminology across the FSC system and avoid any unnecessary confusion, we are now adopting negligible and non-negligible risk designation. Risk designation also now have objective and clear criteria. A complete review is still required every 5 years, but now an annual review is needed as well. This will be an expedited process with a targeted consultation and focused on risk designation, legislation, and update of mitigation measures to ensure that any relevant changes are captured. Mitigation measures are now specified for when there is any non-negligible risk and exists per type of risk. For assessments of risk indicators, now we are aligned across various sustainability schemes such as Preferred by Nature, with a standardized template with a clear structure for assessing each type of risk per indicator at the same geopolitical spatial scale. Each country is automatically at a non-negligible risk designation for conversion, which aligns with FSC's policy to address conversion in EUDR by ensuring developers of risk assessments come up with effective mitigation measures for conversion that can be applicable in the area under assessment. I will now pass over to Nico Macia Rojas, who is the process lead, to provide some more detail about these key changes and how it looks in this procedure.
Thank you very much, Janika, and hello, everybody. Just maybe for those who don't know me, well, as Janika said, I'm in charge of the revision process of risk assessments, and I'm part of the country requirements program at the Performance and Standards Unit. I've been working with FSC for more than 6 years now in risk assessments and other related also topics. Good, so I would like to give you more insights on how will be the assessment of forest degradation. We have added a new indicator to the framework, number 61. There is no forest degradation since 31st December 2020, in alignment with EUDR requirements. In order to assess this indicator, we have established 3 non-negligible risk thresholds, which means that based on the sources available for assessing risk related to forest degradation, if the evidences prove that potential risks meet one of the thresholds, then the indicator should be designated with non-negligible risk. As you can observe, one of the thresholds, as you can observe in the slide, one of the thresholds is numerical. Degradation of forests since 31st December 2020 is more than 0.02% on average per year. In the case of conversion, indicator 68, there is no conversion from forest to agriculture since 31st December 2020, also includes in the assessment non-negligible risk thresholds. Nevertheless, in alignment with the FSC policy to address conversion, there is no numerical threshold, and the default risk designation for this indicator will be non-negligible globally. In chamber balance processes, a working group may designate an area as negligible risk on conversion, provided they are able to demonstrate that conversion has not taken place. Through the FSC Pro 66B risk assessment framework procedure, risk assessment will be developed to provide strong requirements to uphold social and environmental values, ensuring our 3 chambers of FSC are reflected and going beyond EUDR requirements. The risk assessments outline 76 indicators, including land use and management, taxes and fees, corruption and document and data falsification, human and labor rights, high conservation values, conversion and forest degradation, genetically modified organisms, which we know as GMO, environmental protection, health and safety, third parties' rights, trade and transport, due diligence, due care. We would like to show you in more detail how we're expecting to assess indicators in order to arrive at an homogeneous risk designation. Let's focus on the example provided in the table under this slide. Let's imagine that we are assessing risk in Brazil. And for the indicator 639, legal requirements related to child labor and employment of young workers are complied with. For this indicator, there is non-negligible risk at the department level, which is the geopolitical scale that we are using in this case, of this example. But on top of that, the available evidences allowed us to arrive at a risk designation at a finer scale, which is the source types. Yeah. In this context, there are potential risks in private forests, but in other type of forests, the risk is negligible. So it means that although you have arrived at a non-negligible risk designation at the department level, you have been able to differentiate in the specific department that in public forests, there is a different type of risk than in other type of forests. The developer of the risk assessment shall provide at a minimum shapefiles for the geopolitical assessment scale used in GIS format and a clear description of the source types. Although we have an increase in the number of indicators when comparing our current control wood risk assessment framework, which contains 32 indicators, against the revised risk assessment framework, which contains 76 indicators, it is important to highlight that this does not mean that we're adding several new requirements than what we already assess. The example shown in this slide and in the next slide will help to understand the approach we have taken when adapting the indicators. Let's focus on the indicator 1.12 of the Control Wood Risk Assessment Framework regarding legal employment. As you can observe, in order to understand the requirements covered by the indicator, users of this framework had to look at the description. What we are proposing now is to have one indicator per each key requirement related to legal employment. For that reason, now we have 9 indicators covering the requirements about legal employment. For example, indicator 39, focusing on legal requirements related to child labor and employment of young workers. Indicator 41 on modern slavery, including forced and compulsory labor. We also have then Indicator 47 on legal requirements related to worker wages and other payments such as social insurance contributions, or Indicator 52 covering legal requirements related to gender equality in the workplace. As explained before, we are now requiring that whenever a non-negligible risk is designated, mitigation measures have to be proposed in the risk assessment. We're also proposing to have a more detailed approach on how mitigation measures are provided. As per the template to be provided by FSC, we will be requiring the type of verifier, the verifier, and the actions on how to mitigate the identified risk. The example provided in the table is about Indicator 1. Land tenure rights are secure and registered according to legal requirements. According to the results for this indicator, there are risks that require land use right certificate or proof of legal right to use the land is lacking. On plantations in public land, and the type of verifier proposed is the document verification. The specific actions would be, in this case, for example, the land use right certificate or other equivalent documents should cover the correct area and is signed off by the local authority. I will now give the presentation back to Yannicka to present the other parts of the procedure, such as the annexes and the consultation process. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. So as mentioned by Nico, we have some annexes, aka templates. In addition to the process and content requirements included in the risk assessment framework, it also contains 4 annexes. Annex 1 includes a list of stakeholder groups to be consulted in the risk assessment process, considering economic, social, and environmental interests. Annex 2 contains 2 examples of risk assessments considering geopolitical and functional scales. Annex 3 includes the template for actually producing FSC risk assessments. And finally, Annex 4 contains a list of recommended sources of information for these risk assessments. Annex 3 is the actual template for producing a risk assessment. This template outlines the key requirements for assessing risk, essentially by collecting information based on each indicator, considering the scale of assessment, type of risk, and applicable legislation relevant to the area under assessment. Assess this information and designate risk as either negligible or non-negligible. Where non-negligible risk is identified, provide mitigation measures and verifiers per indicator. And then we have Annex 4, which is a list of sources of information. Although this is not an exhaustive list of sources of information, Annex 4 provides a list of recommended sources of information to be used during the development or revision of risk assessments, which will be continuously updated by FSC. We consider this list of sources to be a good starting point for developers of risk assessments when looking for evidence to assess type of risk per indicators. The list has been updated and is divided by key topics such as overarching sources, governance, legal tenure and management rights, high conservation values, deforestation and forest degradation, among others, in connection to the requirements covered by the indicators of the risk assessment framework. This document also classifies the list of sources by the geographical scope of application. For example, if the listed sources are relevant at the global level or the specific regions or countries. It also contains a brief description of each of the sources of information. Nonetheless, country-specific sources of information should also be used during the development or revision of risk assessments, depending on their availability based on the research done by the developer of the risk assessment. So, as mentioned, upon conducting the risk assessment, use the results to designate risk per indicator. And then, of course, where any non-negligible risk is found, review the proposed mitigation measures and implement them. Where FSC risk assessments are not yet developed, organizations can develop an extended company risk assessment using the existing templates in the annexes. For forest managers applying the FSC regulatory module, we are also developing a simplified risk assessment template based on this framework. We are also currently developing a risk assessment library for FSC users to easily access risk based on areas in a digital and accessible format. Since the middle of 2023, FSC has been working together with Preferred by Nature to find better ways to develop and maintain risk assessments to satisfy needs of users in a responsible and effective way. The idea is to develop and maintain better risk assessments by developing them in a harmonized and joint approach in an alliance of credible organizations. This would allow us to reduce efforts by sharing responsibility and expertise of different partners involved. It also would allow for including aspects of commodities beyond FSC's scope to serve the need of a broader group of interested companies. Consequently, we worked over the past few months together with Preferred by Nature to test at a technical level if this is possible, aiming for applying trustworthy methods through shared responsibility for risk assessments. So far, the results are positive, and we have gained additional support from ICL to further work in this direction. Consequently, the next steps to be worked on include a good structure and work plans of a broader group of partners in this risk information alliance, to proceed in working on the technical aspects, and to do capacity building through fundraising. The idea is to later use this Risk Information Alliance to support with streamlining decision-making and process development for risk assessments. While we are incorporating these streamlined processes, this does not mean that FSC is straying from its existing best practices for risk assessment development. There is still the provision for the development of risk assessments through chamber balanced working groups. So, in general, how are risk assessments going to be developed or revised now? There are two options. We have a chamber balance process with equal representation of the environmental, economic, and social chamber members during the development or revision process, and centralized processes, where FSC is leading the process with the support of experts. The involvement of FSC network partners along the process will be possible. Priority countries will be revised through a centralized type of process because we are aiming to align with the timelines set by EUDR. As EUDR is just around the corner, we are fast-tracking the development of EUDR-aligned risk assessments. We have identified 20 priority countries where risk assessments will be developed by March of 2025. The rest will continue to be developed afterwards. Note, of course, that extended company risk assessments are still available where an FSC risk assessment doesn't exist. The request for proposals for the 20 prioritized risk assessments has been published on February 14th this year. Please access the link provided in the chat if you're interested to get some further information on this. The proposal submission deadline has been set for March 8th, so in about 2.5 weeks from now. If you think that you or your organization may have the required qualification and expertise for this type of work, we would invite you to submit a proposal in accordance with the requirements set forth in this request for proposal and the related annexes. We also encourage you to share this request for proposal with other organizations or experts as you consider relevant. And what are these prioritized countries? You can find them on the slide here. The prioritization was done through a criteria based on the forest management certified area, number of chain of custody certificates, relevance of import and export to Europe, and more. The countries are Austria, Brazil, Canada, Chile, China, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Indonesia, Latvia, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, United Kingdom, Ukraine, and the United States of America. As an important reminder, while waiting for the updated FSC risk assessments, there are still two ways to move forward. For users of the FSC regulatory module, where an updated FSC risk assessment does not yet exist, organizations shall develop an extended company risk assessment by using the template provided by FSC, following the requirements of FSC Pro 60006B. For other users not applying the FSC regulatory module, the existing FSC controlled wood risk assessments will remain valid until replaced by the next versions of the corresponding FSC risk assessments. This is regulated as per the Advice Note 40-00526, approved on 30th of August of last year. And another reminder, this is related to another ongoing consultation, which are our system-wide changes for controlled wood. We needed to align terminology from specified and low risk to negligible and non-negligible risk across the FSC system, which is included in this Advice Note 40-00527. In addition, which risk assessments are applicable is outlined in the Advice Note as well. So when participating in this consultation, based on these proposed additional requirements, we are looking for input on questions such as, do you agree with the revised indicators? What do you think about this risk assessment template? Do you agree that the risk assessment framework is now aligned with FSC's policy to address conversion? And should forest degradation be assessed in line with the EUDR? I've talked a lot about key changes in the FSC risk assessments and alignment with EUDR. Let me give you a little bit more insight into the ongoing revision process of the risk assessment framework. The revision of FSC Pro 60006B is a regular type of process following our procedure 01001. The key objectives of the revision of this procedure are the following: update and streamline content requirements for FSC risk assessments, the alignment with strategy for FSC mixed products, and key FSC normative documents and topics, including the policy to address conversion, as well as now the alignment of requirements with EUDR. The setup of this process included a working group formed by 6 chamber-balanced FSC members and 3 technical experts. Note that the approval body is the Policy and Standards Committee, the PSC, who act on behalf of and make recommendations for decisions to the Board of Directors with respect to all technical matters related to the development or revision of FSC policies, standards, procedures, and other normative documents. A lot of effort has gone into this revision process, and it is expected to last 32 months in total. This timeline has been impacted by the efforts by FSC to align with EUDR requirements and the Partnership for Developing Cross-Scheme Risk Assessments. Overall, this process includes working group meetings, 2 public consultations, webinars throughout the process for members and through the FSC network and certification bodies, with targeted engagement and communications efforts. The timeline shown in this slide summarizes the key steps in the process. The revision process began back in November of 2021. 2 working group meetings were organized in 2022, including the drafting of the first version with the sign-off of the working group. Between October and December of the same year, the first draft was released for public consultation. During last year, the following key events had an impact on the overall timelines for this process. We had a change of process lead, EUDR alignment, and ongoing partnership for cross-scheme risk assessments. By the first half of this year, the working group agreed on the sign-off of the second draft before consultation. And the draft is now, of course, under public consultation until 1st of March. During March and April, the final draft will be prepared, including the working group sign-off. And latest by the beginning of May, submission of the final draft will go to the Policy and Standards Committee for approval. A critical step in the process will be the final decision-making by this committee, the Policy and Standards Committee, planned for the end of May 2024. And then, of course, the publication of the approved procedure is planned for 1st of July 2024. The slide also provides information on key steps of the revision process of FSC Pro 60006B, which is shown on top in orange. And this is a procedure that contains the process requirements for forest stewardship standards and FSC risk assessments. We're trying to align both revision processes in order to have the content and process requirements for FSC risk assessments approved at as similar timelines as possible. So let's talk a little bit more about this ongoing consultation and the publication of the new requirements. We have 3 consultations: the FSC regulatory module, this procedure 60006B, aka the risk assessment framework, and our system-wide changes, which are in advice notes. These are cross-cutting topics and requirements, which is why we have them all available simultaneously for consultation. Today we covered the risk assessment framework. And here we are in public consultation, which is open for the next 10 days until March 1st. After the consultation ends, input from the consultation will be assessed and incorporated. Upon approval, requirements will be published on July 1st of this year and become immediately effective for anybody applying the FSC regulatory module. So for those users using our risk assessments for the FSC regulatory module, they can immediately use this framework in July to produce extended company risk assessments. So we know that we have been reviewing a lot in this presentation and the other ones, but also note that we are here to help. To better understand the requirements for consultation, we have been publishing supplemental documents and material. This includes shareable versions of the consultation itself, and FAQs specifically on the requirements in consultation, our normative documents, and most material is all available in French and Spanish as well. We have an introductory video to help understand why it is all simultaneous. We have an info kit for this FSC regulatory module, and this presentation is recorded to be made available on the process page as well. For those applying the related FSC regulatory module, we have a user journey available at fsc-eudr-journey.org. Here you can filter through based on user type to understand what any additional requirements entail and includes additional information about the risk assessment framework. So how do FSC risk assessments actually help you? We have been meticulously developing the requirements and consultation to support our certificate holders to use risk assessments in demonstrating compliance with EUDR practices. This does not mean that we are a green lane and we cannot guarantee compliance, but we have done the groundwork for you. In addition, through our existing third-party verification, you do have an additional safeguard through our assurance systems. We are also currently working on complementary technology tools to seamlessly complement our normative requirements, such as GIS tools and a risk assessment library. Our supporting documentation and tools for these additional requirements are to provide accessible and user-friendly ways for you and your supply chain's journey to compliance. FSC is still a proven leader in the development of risk assessments and exercising due diligence, and we have over 25 years of experience with smallholders, communities, and family forests to support their certification journeys and ultimately additional EUDR compliance support. While I did just discuss technology tools, this is currently not part of the consultation. More information on tools such as GIS, blockchain, due diligence statements, and the risk assessment library will be announced later. There is a new dedicated webpage to learn more about the development of FSC blockchain at fsc.org/blockchain. You can still, of course, also stay tuned through signing up for our newsletter. In the meantime, we ask that you refrain from asking any questions about these tools during this webinar so that we can instead focus on the normative requirements. We are looking forward to your participation in the consultation. This can be accessed at consultation-platform.fsc.org, and it is available for all stakeholders. See you there. We would also ask that you take a really brief moment to scan this QR code or use the link in the chat to give a little bit of feedback on this webinar and also how the consultation is going for you. Promise it should take no more than 5 minutes. And with that, I would now like to give the presentation to Saya Hotti, who is helping us align with EUDR to lead us through the question and answers portion of this presentation.